Hello, ambassadors and fellow Israel travelers. In a way, today's lesson of Bethsaida and Chorazin is a continuation of last week's study of Capernaum, the place Jesus made his base of operations during his Galilean ministry. But as we'll see, his ministry really went out from Capernaum to the towns and cities in about a 5-mile radius, which included our two cities today, Bethsaida and Chorazin. So that those three, Capernaum, Chorazin, and Bethsaida, were kind of regarded as his evangelical triangle. And also, as we're going to see a little later, in one very pointed passage, Jesus linked these three cities together in a bad way. We're going to start by taking a look at Bethsaida. And when we talk about Bethsaida, we're really talking about three locations. There's the plain of Bethsaida, which is where one of Jesus' great miracles took place, but there are also two cities that vie for which was the actual Bethsaida Julius that we read about in the New Testament, in the Gospels. And one of those locations is a place called Et Tel. The other is a place called El Araj. Here's a video from the Satellite Bible Atlas that depicts both areas, Et Tel and El Araj, from the sky.
Recent archaeological excavations may be uncovering the ancient city of Bethsaida, the original hometown of Peter, Andrew, and Philip, disciples of Jesus. According to the New Testament and the first-century Jewish historian Josephus, Bethsaida was located on the northeast side of the Sea of Galilee, just east of where the upper Jordan River enters the sea. Two ruins, one called Et Tel and the other called El Araj, are the best candidates for ancient Bethsaida. El Araj is on the seashore. Et Tel is 1.5 miles north. Here are the excavated ruins at Et Tel, and under these trees, near the shore, is El Araj. Et Tel has been excavated during summer seasons over the last 30 years, since 1987. From the New Testament and the historian Josephus, we would expect to find archaeological remains of two specific periods at ancient Bethsaida. There would be a Jewish fishing village of the early 1st century. Then, Josephus tells us that Herod Philip, the Roman ruler of the area, built up Bethsaida into a city and named it after Caesar's wife, Julius. Herod Philip was buried in Bethsaida Julius. The problem with identifying Et Tel as ancient Bethsaida Julius is that there are little to no archaeological remains from these two periods found here. What has been found at Et Tel are ruins of a significant city from the Old Testament period, like this large city gate. Et Tel was a city of Geshur, a people that remained in the land during the conquest under Joshua. Later, King David married a princess from Geshur, who became the mother of Absalom. At one point, Absalom fled and stayed in Geshur for 3 years. During the divided monarchy, northern Israelite kings like Ahab and Jeroboam II battled with Aramean kings for control of the area. Because the archaeological remains at Et Tel are mostly from the Old Testament period, like this city gate with its pagan shrines, some historians and archaeologists have suspected that the 1st century AD site of Bethsaida Julius is at another nearby ruin called El Araj. The Araj ruin lies on the Sea of Galilee shore, just east of where the upper Jordan River winds its way into the sea. This location fits the geographical descriptions of Bethsaida Julius, given in both the New Testament and Josephus. Note the Sea of Galilee high water bank along this line. The Araj ruins sit right on the high water bank. After hundreds, even thousands of years of abandonment, It is typical that ancient ruins are covered over with dirt and brush. Modern archaeology brings the ruins to light. El Araj has so far been excavated for 2 summer seasons. The excavated areas of the 2016 season can be seen here, partially hidden among the trees. Not far below the surface, archaeologists uncovered significant ruins, like this column, walls, and street or floor pavements. Excavations continued in the summer of 2017. Walls that may be a Byzantine period church were further defined. Deeper yet, remains of a mosaic tile and clay tubes, which were part of a Roman period bathhouse, were discovered. Such a building would be the type of structure we would expect to find in the 1st century AD city of Julius. Further excavation may reveal that El Araj is the location of the 1st century AD city of Bethsaida, Julius.
Here's a look at the Sea of Galilee from what's called the Plain of Bethsaida. The plain is called the Plain of Bethsaida because Bethsaida was the prominent town in that period of time. Unfortunately, we can't tell for sure which it was. Is it Et Tel or is it El Araj? I've got a conclusion. See if you reach the same conclusion that I do. As you can see from another view of it, there's a lot of agriculture that goes on in the area of the Plain of Bethsaida. And so you can see both the delta area here and the agriculture along the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. Here's a picture of Et Tel from the east. Now, the name Bethsaida, which is the name we're looking at here, means house of fishing or possibly house of hunting. It comes from the Hebrew noun Beth, which is the word for house. You'll see a lot of places in the Bible that are referred to as Beth something or another. Bethel, house of God. Bethlehem, house of bread. Things like that. But Beth coupled with the word sud, which in Hebrew either means to fish or maybe to hunt. Josephus writes that Herod Philip made Bethsaida into a city and named it Julius to honor the wife of Augustus. Well, Herod Philip was eventually buried in Bethsaida in 33 AD in his own funeral monument, which unfortunately we haven't located. Josephus says that Bethsaida was located 1/8 of a mile from the river. That would be the Jordan River. There was a road that connected Bethsaida Julius to Caesarea Philippi. That would have been the road that Jesus and his disciples traveled when they were on the way to Caesarea Philippi, where Peter made his great declaration that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and where Jesus announced that he was going to build his church upon that rock of truth, that he is, in fact, the Christ, the Son of the living God. Bethsaida is mentioned 7 times in the Gospels, making it one of the most frequently mentioned cities in the New Testament. And there was a 2nd century rabbi named Shimon ben Gamliel, as well as the Emperor Hadrian, who both spoke of the fact that there was a lot of fish and a lot of fowl found in Bethsaida. It was a place that was rich for both fishing and hunting. There's good reason to doubt that the location of Et Tel is the biblical city of Bethsaida. The biggest reason is the fact that it's not located on a river, it's not located on the Sea of Galilee. It could hardly be called a house of fishing because of its location about 1.5 miles north of the Sea of Galilee and a good distance from the Jordan River. So I believe that a better candidate for biblical Bethsaida is probably El Araj, that is located much closer and right on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. But that doesn't mean Et Tel is not a significant place to study in its own right. Here's a picture of the excavated area of Et Tel from the south. And another picture of Et Tel from the south. And here's another picture of it from the west. Now, there are a number of things that happened in the region that we're talking about here. And remember, the plain of Bethsaida is not a reference just to the location that gave it its name, but also to that green, lush area all the way around it, that plain that you see at the northern part of the Sea of Galilee. Well, one thing we find out in the New Testament is that Bethsaida was the original hometown of Philip, Andrew, and Peter, and possibly others. And it appears that Philip may have continued to live there even as a disciple. It wasn't far from here where Jesus fed the 5,000, in a place that's called the Remote Place, in the vicinity of Bethsaida. It was just outside the village of Bethsaida where Jesus healed a blind man by putting spit on his eyes. And ultimately, it was the fact that Bethsaida, in spite of seeing all that Jesus had done in the region, still refused to believe in him. And that resulted in Jesus condemning them in Matthew 11 and Luke 10. Well, one of the things that we know is associated with Bethsaida is Jesus healing a blind man.
Well, this is Bethsaida, just on the outskirts of the Sea of Galilee. There were really three communities that Jesus spent a lot of time in, a triangle of communities: Capernaum, Chorazin, and Bethsaida. So he spent a lot of time here. This is actually the house of the fishermen. So the archaeologists have discovered hooks and weights and various items used by fishermen who lived in this community. And it's from here that Peter and Andrew and Philip definitely came. And this is their hometown community of Bethsaida. And Jesus therefore spent time here. He performed miracles here. If you read in Mark 8, there was a blind man who lived somewhere in this community. And Jesus healed him in an unusual way. He spat on the mud. What is it about Jesus and spitting, right? He did this in Jerusalem as well. He spat into the mud, made a paste and put it in the man's eyes. And he opened his eyes and he could see, but he wasn't properly healed. He could see people like trees walking around. And so Jesus touched him a second time, and then his 20/20 vision was back. He was properly healed. I don't know why Jesus did this, a two-part miracle. I wonder whether it's because it's a parable for where his disciples are at. They kind of see who he is, but they see him about as clearly as someone who sees people like trees. They get a sense of his greatness, but they haven't yet got 20/20 vision that this is the Messiah and that he has come on a mission that is of global importance. Well, he healed a man with mud here in Bethsaida. The fishermen lived here. Jesus spent a lot of time here, right on the shores of the Sea of Galilee.
Well, this is the view of Et Tel as we'll be entering in it. And this town was a fortified city. It's the one that was known as Zur in the Old Testament. In Joshua 19, verse 35, you read about it. It was in the territory of Geshur, which is the land where Absalom stayed with his grandfather after he killed Amnon, his brother, 2 Samuel 13:38. It was a city that had massive fortifications that were unparalleled for that period. There were two large towers that flanked its entrance, and even today there remains a well-preserved four-chambered gate with a high place, a place of worship of the Canaanite gods. And there are massive stelas that were located in the gate opening. One of them was decorated with a bull-faced warrior. Well, the city was destroyed by the Assyrians in 732 BC. But as you can see at the city gate, there was a big stela that was situated there that depicted the city's Canaanite god. And the actual stela is located in the Israel Museum. This is a replica. You'll see this a lot in Israel, where they've taken the original and put it in the museum, but made a replica to sit in the same spot where the original originally sat. Well, the gate structure is the entrance into the Iron Age city of Gishur. Here's another picture of that Iron Age gate stela replica that depicts again that Canaanite god, the bull god. And again, an entrance into the Iron Age gate of the city. This is another picture of a chamber inside the Iron Age gate that was used for storage, perhaps military equipment. Now, this location at Tel has been under excavation since 1986. Here's a photograph that was taken in 1993 when the excavations were at an early stage, but by now it's been under excavation for about 35 years. And so you can see that it's much farther along than El Araj that we'll see in a few minutes that's only been excavated for about the last 5 or 6 years. Here's a picture of the excavations back again at an earlier time. This is that house of the fisherman that the video was talking about, as well as the house of a vine grower. And what they found is remains from the Bronze, Iron, and Hellenistic and early Roman periods. They found lead fishing weights, they found iron hooks, they found a bronze needle for repairing nets. There's a short section of road from the Roman period that remains here. And there are a few other items that they found, but based upon the fact that they found some fishing gear at one of these houses, they call it the House of the Fisherman. And here's the remains of what they call the House of the Fisherman. They found coins here that date back to the pre-New Testament period. And the area of this residence, the House of the Fisherman they call it, is about 4,300 square feet, with a large courtyard occupying about a third of that space. There's a huge kitchen on the east side that contained 2 ovens. There are a lot of cooking utensils that were found, along with a complete Hellenistic cooking pot. There have been a lot of discoveries found in the courtyard demonstrating that a lot of the family's life was centered there in the courtyard. A lot of shards of imported Roman fineware were found, including pieces of Roman Eastern Terra Siglata pottery. Right next to it is what they call the House of the Winemaker. And this was found with a wine cellar, undisturbed, and 4 intact Hellenistic jars inside, along with a lot of other articles like gold earrings with pictures of animals on them and numerous expensive imported vessels. They also found some fishing gear there. This house is a little smaller. It's about 2,700 square feet. Again, about half of it's a courtyard complex. There's a well-preserved, spacious kitchen to the east that includes an oven and grinding stones of various sizes, some kitchen implements, several broken vessels indicating the presence of a shelf at one point in time. And they even found a Roman door key there in this House of the Winemaker. The courtyard has 3 doorways. The main entry is on the south. It's only preserved up to about 2 feet in height. There's a second entry on the north where the lintel still rests where it fell. The best preserved doorway is on the east, with a threshold still preserved with long iron nails. This is the way the Sea of Galilee looks from Et Tel. You can see it's off in the distance. And this is one of the reasons that I think it's more likely that this is the biblical city of Gishur rather than the city of Bethsaida that we read about in the New Testament. Much closer to the Sea of Galilee is this place called El Araj. And this is a picture of a couple of architectural pieces that were discovered there several years ago before excavations began in earnest. Let me show you about the El Araj excavation project.
Welcome to El Araj. We are concluding our fourth season of excavations here in search of Bethsaida Julius. Oftentimes we're asked why we are digging here. This is a culmination of probably 20 years of scholarship on my part. Of course, I stand on the shoulders of others who've asked the question, where was first century Bethsaida Julius? Bethsaida mentioned in the New Testament, home to Peter, Andrew, and Philip. It's really been a multidisciplinary approach looking at issues of land, language, and as well as the literature, the historical witnesses on this site. And those sort of all come together here as we explore and slowly uncover the ancient remains. To be quite honest, when archaeologists show up here, they're shocked to see the archaeological remains that have been unearthed, because most people thought there was nothing here. Archaeologically, there was no evidence, or very little evidence, of the ancient city under the ground. But historically, there was lots of evidence. We had the testimonies of eyewitnesses who visited this site, both in the New Testament period. We hear the testimony of Josephus, the New Testament, early rabbinic literature, right on up into the Byzantine period, when this site is visited by pilgrims who are coming around the lake from Tiberias, Magdala, Capernaum, and then to this place. The testimony that they gave regarding a Byzantine church here has been confirmed. I would say a couple years ago, people were denying that, saying that the pilgrims were mistaken, that there was no church on this site. Credibility of the pilgrims has been strengthened this season by finding lots of mosaic floor that belonged to the church, seen by Willibald, the Bavarian bishop who came here in 725, saw a large ornate basilica built over the house of Peter and Andrew. We've had two aims this summer, this season, 4 weeks of digging. One was to at last find that lost church and to begin unearthing its remains. The second was to strengthen our ideas regarding this being the site of first century Bethsaida. So we've been excavating in two areas. The main area here in Area A has been focused on the church and dealing with the Byzantine level and finding magnificent mosaics that are very compelling in terms of their witness. And the other is Area C, which is about 100 meters to the north, an area where we found residential homes clearly dated from coins and pottery to the first century AD and before. So clearly there is a presence here. We look forward to the coming seasons. We've done some imaging testing here and found a large area of public dwelling houses that need to be excavated. And so we look forward to expanding the excavation in the coming seasons and confirming that idea and unearthing what I consider the last lost city of the Gospels. As we try to locate a place that Jesus came, ministered, also the home of the apostles, mentioned in rabbinic literature, Josephus himself. This is a crossroads of Jewish and Christian history, I think valuable to both communities, and we feel privileged to be a part of that discovery of this ancient past.
The reason that the excavation at El Araj is going so much slower, or seems to go so much slower than at Et Tel, is because it really hasn't been going on that long. Et Tel has been undergoing excavation since the middle 1980s. El Araj was not even discovered until 2007. Excavation didn't begin until 2014. The pictures I have here are from 2019. Now, unfortunately, El Araj was flooded in 2020, so we don't have any more recent pictures, but the Sea of Galilee high water level came back up and basically flooded the archaeological area where they've been digging. What you've got here is an outline of the Church of the Apostles that was referred to in that video as it's being excavated. Here's a picture of the El Araj excavations from the sky. And as you can see, and he mentioned, there are those two locations that they're digging that are about 100 meters apart. This brings up something that I think is important for archaeological excavations, and that is what we see when we go to these locations is just a small part of a much larger area. So whether it's Capernaum or whether it's Bethsaida or whether it's Caesarea Philippi or wherever we go where archaeologists are beginning to uncover things, it takes a while, many years, for them to actually uncover an entire city. And all we get to see are bits and pieces of what has been uncovered so far. Here's a picture of the mosaic floor of that Church of the Apostles that he was talking about. And you can see that there's an inscription in Greek that would be appropriate for a Byzantine era church. Here's another picture of that mosaic floor. You saw the little boy brushing off. Well, this is what they've uncovered so far. And here's a picture of that cross from the Church of the Apostles that they only recently discovered, but they knew it was there all along. This is the way the excavations look at El Araj at the end of the 2019 excavation period. Now, the thing that sets El Araj apart in my mind from Et Tel is that El Araj is much more likely to be a fishing village based upon its location.
When we talk about the excavations here at El Araj and the question of this being Bethsaida or not, one of the subjects that comes up, of course, is the name, the very name itself, Bethsaida. The name means house of fishing, place of fishing, which is one of the things that I think is compelling about our site, is that it's so close to where the first century shoreline was, which is where you would put a fishing villages, having access to water. This is actually all part of a large alluvial plain here, a delta region in the surrounding area. The New Testament refers to it as the wilderness of Bethsaida. Sometimes the translations read desert. It certainly is not desert. It's an area that is not settled. It's an area for grazing. And this delta region, the Bethsaida Plains, is fed by three primary tributaries: the Madrese on the east, and then in the center the Zaki, which is not far from us, and then on the other side is the Jordan River. Those three are primary tributaries feeding into the Sea of Galilee, the Lake of Kinneret. And it's interesting, in the excavations that have uncovered the histories past here, they found a worked bone tool that was used, a stone tool that's used for fishing, repairing fishing nets. This is a place that you would use it again to repair your nets, which we hear about in the Gospels. We hear about the fishermen, some of Jesus' followers were fishermen, and using probably implements very much like this in terms of repairing their nets. Also, we found numerous lead weights that would be used for the bottom of the nets, weighting them down, and sort of the primary type of fishing here is using drag nets, and you would need the bottom of the nets being weighted down with these lead weights. Again, all of these belong to the period of time when this site, El Araj, Bethsaida, was a place of fishing. We know from the New Testament, from early rabbinic literature and Josephus, that the shoreline near here was a place of rich fishing, a lot of fishing activity, even to this day. The best fishing in the lake is right in the area where we're excavating. These small implements, although they themselves don't look very significant, but when you put them together and you put them with the history of what we know went on at Bethsaida, it's another piece of evidence that speaks to us of the people who were living here, their occupations, and things that they did.
Well, here's a look at the plain of Bethsaida with green grass. Why do I want to show you a plain with green grass? Well, the northeastern shore of the Sea of Galilee is really a very fertile plain, and it is probably the place where the feeding of the 5,000 took place. Mark 6:30 says the feeding took place at a solitary place. And after this, Jesus and his disciples went over to Bethsaida. Well, the plain of Bethsaida is about 5 square miles. It's very spacious. It's crisscrossed by streams and aqueducts and irrigation canals, and there are a lot of flat hills where it would be possible to seat large numbers of people. Now, Matthew and Mark refer to the location of the feeding as a desert place. The English Standard Version says desolate place. The New International Version says solitary place. However, we need to understand also that the Scripture says it was green at the time. John 6:10, talking about the same incident, doesn't mention a desert place, but he says it's a place of much grass. Luke says that Jesus went to a desolate place near Bethsaida. The Greek word eremos is the word that is normally translated desert, but as is always the case, the meaning of a word is determined by its context. And so the idea of the word is basically lonesome. It's not necessarily desert. It could be desolate. It could be solitary. It could be a wilderness, a wild area. But it's a translation from the Hebrew word midbar. And the Hebrew word midbar had 2 meanings in Hebrew and Aramaic. It meant an uninhabited or uncultivated, barren region, but it also meant a pasturing place. And the midbar of a city in Hebrew literature referred to that city's pasture land. So it's the area outside of the city wall where the flocks and herds were grazed. And so probably translators were not aware of that second meaning when they came along and translated it the desert of Bethsaida, because it's really a very lush grazing area around the city. So the feeding of the 5,000 took place probably on the plain of Bethsaida, maybe some little distance from the populated areas. And so a good candidate for the location is this southeastern end of the plain between the slopes of the Golan Heights and the Sea of Galilee. Here's another picture of the plain of Bethsaida, and I'll remind you that when Mark tells the story about Jesus feeding the 5,000, Mark 6:39 says Jesus told them to have the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So it's not a desert like we think of. Here's the plain of Bethsaida from the east. And here's another view of it from the southeast. So that's a look at the 2 locations that vie for being the city of Bethsaida. But there's another city we probably won't visit on our trip to Israel, and yet you can't think about Capernaum and Bethsaida without also thinking about Chorazin. Jesus said this, "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes." Think about what Jesus had to say to Chorazin and Bethsaida.
We're in Chorazin. Chorazin today, 900 feet above Lake Galilee, just in the basin behind us. Jesus came to this community regularly, and now it's an archaeological dig exposing this brittle basalt volcanic rock that they built their homes with. You can see the arches that they used to create height, and this is a communal courtyard. People would have been having shared ovens and food and family life and children playing here, and all around the courtyard you can see where they had their own private dwellings. Come over this way and you can see some of these private homes that they would have had, where people would have had their own personal space and a guest room for people coming to visit if they had enough room. And this is the kind of community then that Jesus visited and taught crowds. You can see over this way the synagogue where he would have been teaching, and sitting down. The person teaching the law or Torah sat down to teach. So here in the synagogue he taught crowds of people, and Jesus performed many miracles right here in Chorazin. In fact, there were three communities that saw a lot of Jesus: Chorazin, where we are now, Capernaum, and also Bethsaida. And in Luke's gospel, Jesus actually spoke some harsh words to them. Woe to you, Chorazin, speaking to this community. He said, woe to you, because he said, there's the miracles I've performed among you, and still you don't believe. Jesus holds us to account for all that he's done in our lives, that we're expected to respond to it. He has some quite severe words, actually, for a community that refused to put their faith in the Messiah, despite all that he'd done. In this courtyard, in these homes, in this beautiful setting above the Sea of Galilee. This is Chorazin.
Well, here's a picture of the panorama of Chorazin from the west. Eusebius and Jerome both locate the ruins of Chorazin 2 miles north of Capernaum. And this is the location that is believed to be the ancient city of Chorazin. There was a paved road in ancient times that ran from this town to the great international highway that led past the Sea of Galilee to Damascus. And you can see the Golan Heights in the distance. You can see a part of the ruins of Chorazin that have been excavated. There's a synagogue there. Just over the ridge there, you see the plain of Bethsaida. And then you see the Sea of Galilee, and in the distance you can see Hippos. Well, here's a closer view of Chorazin with the Nahal Chorazin. That's kind of a gully where water flows in the wet part of the year. And another view of Chorazin from the northwest. And yet another closer view of Chorazin. And here's what it looks like from the west. And from the southwest. Here's the view of the Nahal Chorazin toward the north from Chorazin. And here's the way things look down toward the Sea of Galilee. Now, the city of Chorazin is not mentioned in the Old Testament, and it's not mentioned by Josephus. It was a Galilean town. The only mention we have of it in the New Testament is when Jesus condemns them for rejecting his message. Even though the inhabitants had witnessed many miracles, they were cursed for their unbelief in Matthew 11 and Luke 10. Chorazin is not described in the Bible. There's not a single recorded event that occurs here. It's just cursed. Now, that doesn't mean Jesus didn't visit there, and it doesn't mean he didn't do miracles there. It just means that they weren't recorded in the Gospels. But even if he didn't visit Chorazin, or he didn't actually do miracles here, undoubtedly people from Chorazin were aware of what was going on in Capernaum, just 2 miles to the south, and in Bethsaida and the area in the Bethsaida plain just a little bit to the east. Because those three locations, commonly called the evangelical triangle, Jesus condemned them, and today they lie in ruins. Only Bethsaida has not been located with certainty, but even then, for centuries, the cities of Chorazin and Bethsaida were unknown until they were finally excavated only within the last 100 years or less. Certainly when Jesus said, "Woe to you, Chorazin, and woe to you, Bethsaida," that would have stung the Jews when he said to them, You're worse than the Phoenicians and the people of Sodom, both of whom were known for their wickedness. Well, here's a hillside near Chorazin and Capernaum. The town of Chorazin thrived until the 2nd century A.D., and the population of this region expanded as a result of the rebellion called the Bar Kokhba Rebellion against Rome. In the Talmudic literature, there was mention of the fact that this was a very agriculturally rich area. The quality of wheat in this area was excellent. But the city died out by about the middle of the 4th century. And when Jerome wrote in the early 5th century, he said it was deserted. Here's a view of the excavations of Chorazin from the west. The earliest remains that have been discovered so far have been from the 2nd century A.D., not any from the 1st century. But then, on the other hand, not much of this 80-acre tell has been excavated, and the 1st century city has yet to be located. Most of the remains that have been discovered have been from the 2nd to 4th centuries, showing a good idea of what a Galilean town looked like in the Roman period. One of the features of Chorazin that I really appreciate is the synagogue that we'll look at in a few minutes. But you see a lot of construction from that black basalt stone that I've been telling you about in some of these Galilean regions. Here's that black volcanic rock that was used to build a house. There's a basalt house. And if you'll notice, most of the stones were rough, unhewn stones that would just kind of fit together however they could fit to make a good solid wall. Even though basalt is a very hard stone, it's also very brittle. And that means that beams that you can use can't be very far apart. In fact, they had to use arches to get around the limitations of the brittleness of the stone. So you'll see this house of arches at Chorazin. It's been standing since the 13th century, and it's an example of medieval construction. This was apparently a fairly wealthy family, and the house would have been quite comfortable. But if you look close, you'll see that the arches are built very close together. And that's because the entire house was built out of stone, including the roof. These arches supported the basalt slabs which covered the rooftop. Basalt is so heavy that it breaks under its own weight, so they had to put arches close together to allow for that span. And here's a close look at a basalt roof on top of those arched beams. Another look at a basalt house with the arch. Basalt steps going up to a paved courtyard. And this is the courtyard you saw in the video. It kind of fronts all of the houses in the community, so they have a big shared area where people mixed and mingled. One of the things you'll see a lot of in Israel is mikvahs, because the mikvahs, what we might think of as baptistries, were used for ritual cleansing. Well, this one was near the synagogue. It was a place where people would have ritually dipped themselves before going into the synagogue to worship. And there's a cistern behind it that provided water to a pool. And this was a part of the Jewish ritual of daily cleansing. Here's a picture of the area around Chorazin looking toward the Sea of Galilee. And you'll see things here like you see in other places, an oil press, evidence of the rich agricultural wealth of the area, where the olives were crushed by that stone like we'll see in Nazareth village. And then once they're pressed by heavy beams or a screw, forcing the oil out in this shallow circular channel and down into a plastered receptacle where it was gathered for use in a variety of ways. Here's a 2nd century synagogue from Chorazin. And Galilean synagogues were typically built in this way. What you see is 2 of the 3 front doors into the synagogue. and you see the big lintel that was over that center door that's been reconstructed but not put back up over the door where it would have been originally. Another closer view of the synagogue facade, and a closer view so you can see the kind of artwork that they did in the 2nd century. Here's a view of the synagogue from the southeast, the part that remains of it. And here's what it looked like on the inside. Men and women were apparently not segregated in the synagogue during the New Testament period, and it's not certain when this practice began, but it may not have begun until the Middle Ages. Most likely they had wooden furniture in there, much like we have in churches today, so that the people sat and listened to the teaching of the rabbi. And along the wall, you'll see seats that are designed for the elders to sit. If you look near the front entrance, you'll see a special stone seat. The original is found in the Israel Museum, but this is a replica of that seat. The seat is known as the seat of Moses, or Moses' seat. This is the seat that Jesus referred to when he talked about in Matthew 23, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must obey them and do everything they tell you, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. Well, here's an example of the Moses seat that Jesus is referring to. And there were apparently Moses seats in all of the synagogues where the one who is teaching the Torah would sit when he taught. Maybe you'll recognize this guy. This is about 7 years and 50 pounds ago. Here are the architectural fragments that decorate the Chorazin synagogue, and another picture of more architectural fragments. Here's a fragment that's hard to explain. Here we are in the Chorazin synagogue, and we have not only a picture of an image that was prohibited by the Old Testament, by the 10 Commandments, but also it looks like a decoration of either the Greek god Helios or the Greek goddess Medusa. And here are more architectural fragments. What you'll see more often than not is pictures of grapes, pomegranates, palm trees, things like that. But again, here's a picture that's hard to explain. Men with grapes, even though the Old Testament 10 Commandments prohibited the making of images of living creatures. Here's an architectural fragment, again from the synagogue, and another one. And here's a basalt stone with a floral decoration. Now, also at Chorazin, there is a funeral area called a dolmen. This was a place where stones were put on top of stones to create tombs for probably prominent people in the community. Well, what's the importance of Chorazin and Bethsaida? Matthew 11, verses 20 to 24 reads this way. Then he began to denounce the cities where most of his mighty works had been done, because they did not repent. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works done to you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I tell you, it would be more bearable on the day of judgment for Tyre and Sidon than for you. And you, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven? You'll be brought down to Hades. For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day. But I tell you that it will be more tolerable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom than for you. Think about everything that had been done in this evangelical triangle. Philip, Andrew, and Peter were from Bethsaida, according to John 1:44. Jesus healed a blind man there, according to Mark 8. It was near Bethsaida where Jesus fed the 5,000 in Luke 9 and John 6. and not far from Bethsaida, where he walked on the water and calmed the sea. And then two of his followers at least, Simon Peter and Andrew, his brother, moved with Jesus to Capernaum. And it was at Capernaum that Jesus did so many of the miracles. He taught in the synagogue there. He healed a demoniac who was brought to him while he was teaching. He healed Peter's mother-in-law and many others. He raised the dead. He healed the servant of a Gentile centurion who had befriended the Jewish community by building the synagogue in which he taught. He healed a nobleman's son. He raised the 12-year-old daughter of the synagogue ruler Jairus. And on his way to do that, a woman who had been suffering bleeding for 12 years touched his robe and was healed. And when he left Jairus' house, he healed 2 more blind men and a demon-possessed man. When it came time to pay the temple tax, Jesus sent Peter to catch a fish with a promise that the first fish he caught would have the money for the temple tax in its mouth. Jesus taught his famous Bread of Life sermon in the synagogue of Capernaum after feeding the 5,000 on the northeastern shore, after walking on the sea on the way back. And that was the occasion when Simon Peter tried and failed to walk on the water and had to be rescued by Jesus. He taught his kingdom parables about 1 mile southwest of Capernaum in a place called Sower's Cove. He preached the Sermon on the Mount about 2 miles west of Capernaum, and yet ultimately, in spite of everything they had seen and heard, Capernaum was one of the 3 towns Jesus condemned because of their unbelief. According to Jesus, the evangelical triangle of Capernaum, Chorazin, and Bethsaida would be worse off than Tyre, Sidon, and even Sodom on the day of judgment. So what's the message that Jesus has for Chorazin and Bethsaida? The message is Jesus is the judge, and he will condemn the unrepentant. In spite of everything Chorazin and Bethsaida had seen him do in the region, they still rejected him. And so Jesus says, ultimately in the day of judgment, they will stand condemned. And what's the message to Capernaum? The city where Jesus made his home base, the place where he did more miracles than any other place during his earthly ministry, the place where he gave sight to the blind and healed demon-possessed people and paralytics and brought the dead to life. And yet this city just was indifferent to him. And Jesus says, ultimately, indifference is worse than immorality. The people of Sodom would have turned from their sin, and the city would have been spared if Jesus had done there what he did in Capernaum. You know, we can't afford to wallow in our sins, and we cannot afford to be indifferent to our Lord, because to do either incurs his judgment. Well, that's our look at Chorazin and Bethsaida. Next week, we'll take a look at some of the other areas on the western side of the Sea of Galilee, including Magdala, the home of Mary Magdalene. In the meantime, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.